spent quite a bit of time out here with his wife, the third Mrs. Wright, while he was working on the designs for that. And they both really fell in love with the desert. It's very different from their home in Spring Green, Wisconsin, the original Taliesin, where of course in Wisconsin you have lush green rolling hills, and here it's a little bit different. It's a little more flat, a little less green, but you have these really interesting mountains that pop up all around you. And Mr. Wright's big philosophy for architecture is organic architecture. He wants his buildings to blend in with their environment, be one with their surroundings. So here in such a different environment, he's really inspired to come up with something new. So he makes quite a few trips back out to Arizona between 1928 and 1937. He does some designs for a resort hotel that's supposed to be built down in Chandler. Never built though because of the Great Depression. But during those trips out, he's really just camping and pretty basic canvas tents. So you'll see some inspiration from those camping trips in the buildings here as we go. But finally in 1936, Mr. Wright's overcoming a pretty bad bout of pneumonia. So his doctor tells him that if he makes Arizona his permanent winter home, he might live for another 20 years. So he decides to make it his permanent winter home, lives for almost another 22 years. So pretty good decision on his part. But there is a period of time in Mr. Wright's career, in the teens and the 20s, where he doesn't have a lot of work coming in. He's had some personal drama, people aren't coming to him for new commissions, and then 1929, the stock market crashed, the Great Depression, nobody's really building anything. So in 1932, it's Mrs. Wright that comes up with the idea to start an architecture school. Mr. Wright's always had apprentices working with him pretty much since the beginning of his career, but at this point they make it a little more official, and these apprentices pay him $600 a year to come work with him, learn from him, and really do a little bit of everything here at the site in Arizona and at the site in Wisconsin. Mr. Wright himself had only 1 year of formal education. He studied engineering at the University of Wisconsin before he quit school and then apprenticed with other architecture firms in Chicago. So when he opens his school in 1932, it's really based on hands-on learning and learning by doing, his apprenticeship or fellowship, as he calls it. And Mr. Wright decides to open the school because they could really use a little bit of extra money. He always has a little bit of an issue with money. He was very successful, probably made a great deal of money, but spent it just as quickly as he brought it in, if not faster. So when he comes out here in 1937 to begin construction, he brings about 25 apprentices with him. And one of the first tasks for the apprentices is to look around the surrounding environment here to see if there's any materials he can use in construction. You know, that goes along with his organic architecture philosophy. If you're using materials from the surrounding environment, your buildings really will blend in. But again, he's also trying to build this as cheaply as possible. He has just enough money from his commission at Falling Water in Pennsylvania to buy the property up here in the McDowell Mountains. At the time, he buys about 640 acres, averaging at $12 to $13 an acre. Pretty good deal even back then. But when he sends the apprentices out to find pretty much anything out in the desert, they come across something interesting. These petroglyphs here. So feel free to get closer if you can't see them. They're basically drawings on rock, done by the Hohokam Native Americans, who are the original residents of this area, here from about the 1st century to the 15th, so quite a while. And as a result, you can find petroglyphs in several different areas in Arizona, and today it's pretty illegal to move them, but when Mr. Wright was here, it wasn't illegal yet, so he moves a few of them. You'll see about 3 or 4 as we go through the site, and he puts them all in places he thinks works well with his architecture and his design. But he was especially fascinated with the swirl pattern you see there, kind of second from the left. And to the Hohokam, we think that represented a whirling arrow, but to Mr. Wright, he saw 2 hands clasped together in friendship or fellowship, which goes along with the fellowship of apprentices that he brought here with him. So he used that as his symbol of Taliesin West, and we still do today. It's on our water bottles, it's on all of your tickets, it's even in the metal design on that stone structure back towards the bookstore, so in quite a few places. But the name Taliesin, something most people are pretty curious about. So that comes from Mr. Wright's Welsh heritage. He grew up in Wisconsin with his mother's rather large Welsh family and was very influenced by them. Taliesin is the name of a mythological bard in Welsh mythology, and his name meant shining brow because apparently you could see him coming from miles away because of his shining brow. And Mr. Wright builds his buildings here into the side of the mountain, or the brow of the mountain, if you want to look at it the way he saw it. And then the Taliesin in Wisconsin, he builds that into the side of the hill, or the brow of the hill. Because he said if you build on top of a mountain or on top of a hill, you're ruining its natural shape, which goes against his organic architecture philosophy. But any questions at this point, before we really get into things? Nothing yet? Okay.
What's your name?
Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
Is this a public property now? Is it still private?
Still private, yeah. I'll be telling you more about what happens here, but people still live here, and there's still very active architecture school. So, yeah. And obviously, tours. Great. All right, well, we're just going to move about 5. Okay, so Lloyd Wright is incredibly influenced by Asian art and Asian culture. He actually makes quite a few trips out to Japan to buy and collect art there, especially screen prints and sculptures. He also designs the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, Japan, which is one of the few buildings to survive an earthquake that happened in 1923, so that gives him some notoriety and fame for engineering skills. He also feels a very close connection with the Japanese on their love of nature. He really has a very serious appreciation for nature and is actually known to have said that God is spelled like nature with a capital N, so kind of a spiritual connection for him. These sculptures here, not Japanese though. These are Chinese. Story behind these is that he found them in Chinatown in San Francisco, went into the shop there to see how much they cost, and they happened to be a little too expensive for him, so he decides to buy the broken ones that had broken on their way over in shipment because he gets a pretty good deal on them. And the apprentices are the ones who are asked to put them back together again. So they do, but then everybody leaves for the summer to go back to Wisconsin because it gets a little too hot in Arizona in the summer, and they come back the next winter to find them all in pieces again. I guess the glue that the apprentices had used hadn't survived the summer that year. So you'll notice that our sculptures are missing some hands, heads, arms, other body parts. We think these are probably out in the desert somewhere. Pack rats around here love shiny things. They probably came, collected some pieces, and now they're long gone. But you will see about 12 of these sculptures as we go through the site. And Mr. Wright really liked them because it's a Chinese theater scene. So it's like an architectural scene within his architecture. And he puts them all in places of transition. This is one really important place of transition because his office is right here. So he'd have his clients park their cars on the gravel where we were all just standing, then welcome them in his office, hopefully sell them some designs. So as we go in, if you could all just kind of wave your tickets, which is pretty average for someone born around Civil War time. We think he was probably closer to 5'6", especially as he got older. He was known to wear high-heeled shoes and tall hats to make himself appear a little bit taller. You can see him here in a 3-piece tweed suit, always dressed to the nines. But over here, the low ceiling, not really because of his height. This is an architectural technique called compress and release. So with the odd-shaped door and the low ceiling, he's making you feel really uncomfortable. So you don't want to stay in this space for too long. You feel compressed, you move quickly through into here, where it's much more open and much more comfortable. And that's really important if you're a client of his. He wants them to come quickly through and look at the designs he'd have set up on the table in the middle here. But I mentioned at the beginning, Mr. Wright's using materials from the surrounding environment to build this site and doing it as cheaply as possible. So the floor here is just a pretty basic poured concrete, but he mixes a red tint right into it. And this is a really modern idea. This is something that we still do today, but Mr. Wright was using his winter desert camp out here as an architectural laboratory. So he's always experimenting with different ideas, different materials, and different designs. And this was an experiment that happened to work quite well for him. You'll see a lot of red as we go through the site. He calls Cherokee red his favorite color. He said it was the color of life. Pretty much, Cherokee red is pretty much this darker faded red, but you see a lot of different shades. The walls here, built pretty simply with just a wooden frame that he filled with these large quartzite rocks. You can find pretty much everywhere out in the desert around here. And then the rest of the space he fills with a really dry mixture of concrete, so using the least amount of water possible. And that's for a few reasons, but the big one, we're in the middle of the desert. There's really not too much water around here, at least for the first few years that they're here. Their water situation does change, and I'll tell you about that as we go. But Mr. Wright also likes the rough texture of a dry mix of concrete. It looks more natural, and the majority of the concrete mix is made out of sand from the desert, so he wants to show that. And then a dry mix of concrete also won't flow as easily over the face of these quartzite rocks, which are the real showpiece in the walls. And anything painted red in the roof structures, pretty much above our heads here, that was originally redwood. That was the cheapest wood that Mr. Wright could find in the lumber yard. But wood doesn't really last too long in the dry desert climate. It gets dry rot pretty quickly, so after just a couple years, he replaced the redwood with Douglas fir. But again, another type of wood, really not lasting too long. So he was constantly replacing these roof structures until he started to use steel, which is what we have today. So
This is a fireplace that he used, or
yes.
It looks like a fireplace.
Yeah, I'll tell you about that.
Okay.
So today we have steel, so anything with a smoother texture on it. Like these V-beams here, that'll be steel. But you will see some wood elements, and those are more decorative. And then our roof panels here, originally just canvas, and this is where that camping inspiration comes into play. Mr. Wright really loves the way that sunlight filters through canvas. You get this really nice soft glow in here. It's a lot less harsh than the sunlight that's outside. And that's really important if you have designs on white paper. Sunlight reflects off white paper, can be kind of harsh on your eyes. If you've ever read a book outside, you know what I'm talking about. So he's making it nice and easy for his clients to come look at his designs. Canvas, like wood though, does not last too long in the desert. Degrades pretty quickly in the sunlight. So our canvas panels today, only partly canvas. We have bottom layer of canvas, a layer of insulation, and then a layer of acrylic on top of that. So it helps it last a little bit longer, but maybe not as long as we'd like, because our conservation team is still experimenting with different materials. That keeps this really nice soft glow in here, but lasts as long as possible. Any of the glass that you see on the site, so that wasn't put in until 10 years after they started construction and after they started living here. So very, very open, a very literal connection with nature, which Mr. Wright loved. But Mrs. Wright didn't really like that idea too much. Probably kind of nice in here when you had breezes blowing through on a hot day, but you also had birds flying through, creatures of all shapes and sizes coming in here, and probably a lot of dust. So Mrs. Wright was constantly trying to convince him to put glass in. And he swore up and down that glass had no place in his desert camp because there's no natural formation of glass in the desert. So finally, Mrs. Wright does manage to convince him by telling him she had a dream that he put glass at Taliesin West. Apparently, she told the story of the dream so well, he was so intrigued, he puts glass in, and then tells everybody it's the best idea he ever had. Yeah. But that drawing on the back wall, kind of an interesting story if you take a look at that. So that's a rendering done for a design that Mr. Wright did for an Arizona State Capitol building in 1957. So the Arizona government was looking to expand on its current Capitol building, but Mr. Wright told them they didn't need this for them for free. And I think it was a little too modern because this is never actually built. They go with somebody else's design. Never built except for the spire in the middle though. That's on Lloyd Wright Boulevard. If anyone's familiar with it. Yeah, I've seen it. It's pretty neat. It's a little bit shorter than the original design because it's next to an airport over there, but blue and green and lights up at night, and there's an interesting sculpture garden around the bottom of it, and I'll be telling you about the artist for those sculptures in a little while. And yes, the fireplace over here. So you will find a fireplace in every room on the site. Really the only way that he heated these rooms. You know, it gets pretty chilly in the desert at night, even now, on warmer days. But he designs them all in this really interesting, kind of discreet way. You wouldn't necessarily know that's a fireplace at first glance. But keep an eye out for them. You will find one in every room. Any questions before we move on? To be built on the site in 1937 was this one right here. This is Mr. Wright's vault. So he kept all of his prized possessions in here, which were his designs and drawings, because that's pretty much where the money came from. And this is a really important structure for him because it's fireproof. The Taliesin in Wisconsin burnt down on a couple different occasions. So he's very concerned about fire, makes a few decisions around the site here on ways he can prevent it from happening, ways to keep it from spreading, or ways to put it out quickly if it does happen. But you'll notice this structure is pretty tall, pretty vertical, but Lloyd Wright doesn't like vertical lines. He loves his horizontal lines. So he puts in these horizontal indents here, which you can find pretty much all around the site. Made pretty simply with just a wooden triangle in the frame as he's filling it with concrete. But these indents encourage your eyes to move from side to side instead of up and down. So you look side to side, look around the site, admire his very flat horizontal buildings, maybe compare them to the very flat horizontal desert that's out there. And at certain times of day, these indents give you a really interesting shadow pattern, kind of a zigzagging line across the ground here. Mr. Wright does a lot with shadow patterns and light patterns throughout the site. Just kind of depends on the time of day and where you are. Hopefully we'll see some examples of that in the living room, but he basically uses all elements at his disposal out here. Sunlight, the sun, almost never ending out here in the desert. And hopefully we'll get to see the geometric patterns. He designed some really interesting windows for sunlight to come through and give you these really amazing patterns. But in case you haven't caught on quite as how much Mr. Wright wants to connect his buildings to nature, we have a very literal connection over here. not here when Mr. Wright was here, but we're all pretty sure he'd be very happy with this little literal connection between nature and his buildings. But as we move around the site, you'll notice that our stairs are a little bit different than your normal staircase. So they're only about 4 inches high and about 16 inches deep. A very gentle slope, which is mimicking the surrounding environment here. All the buildings are built on the mesa on the side of the mountain, and from here you get a very gentle slope down into the valley. But Mr. Wright is also manipulating his guests a little bit again, kind of like the compress and release. But here he's making them a little more graceful than they would be on a normal day, because he wants them to glide around his property. They're basically part of the decoration, and he wants them to look good next to his buildings. But any questions before we glide on a little bit? The blue spires, yes, good question. So, originally, before they had glass, you could use those to tie canvas onto so they could at least cover the openings in case of a storm, protect the inside of the room. Once they had glass though, kind of just a decorative element now. You notice these checkerboard patterns, which I know seems a little bit out of place here, but that is Frank Lloyd Wright design. Very geometric pattern, and I'll tell you about Mr. Wright's geometric inspiration, probably from this point here. And that's because you can see the majority of the main complex. So at this end, we have the drafting studio, where Mr. Wright's apprentices were learning how to design and draw, working on their own projects, working on his projects. And this is where our architecture students are doing almost the exact same thing. We have our very active architecture school on site, about 15 students enrolled today. And I'll be telling you more about the school as we go, and we'll stop into the drafting studio towards the end of our tour. In the center here, with the overhanging eaves, that was the original kitchen. Very basic for quite a while they're building all these structures. So originally just a concrete countertop with a camp stove right on top of that. Next to the kitchen, on the right-hand side, that band of windows, that was the original dining room. Later became private living quarters for Mr. Wright's son-in-law apprentice and engineer named Wes Peters, who is the one who took over the architectural practice after Mr. Wright passes away in 1959. And today it's just a conference room and meeting room for the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation and the Architecture School. And you'll notice a second floor up there, some balconies and windows. Then there's about 3 or 4 apartments up there. We still have a lot of people that live on the site today. So all of our students live on site, some faculty members, staff members, fellows, and a few of Mr. Wright's former apprentices still live here. They're in their late 80s and early 90s, and basically after they were done learning from Mr. Wright, starting their own careers, they just decided not to leave. It's a very interesting, inspiring, creative community around here, and now they're part of our living history, which I think makes our site really unique.
How many people live here?
I'm not sure the exact number. Rough guess would be about 40.
Wow.
Yeah, so quite a lot, quite a few. There's a lot of buildings we don't see on the tour because they're private residences, but yeah.
And are they dispersed around the...
Pretty much, yeah. So our property goes quite a bit away, that away, back towards the mountain.
Do they pay rent or they own?
Not that I know of, but they all kind of contribute to the site in one way or another.
It's like a commune.
Kind of, yeah.
And who runs who runs the school?
It's just like a regular school. There's a faculty and a dean, so yeah.
So anyone can apply from anywhere in the world?
Absolutely. Yeah, anybody can apply.
Yeah.
How many students is it about?
There's about 15 today.
Okay.
Yeah.
15
Yeah.
students. It's very private, very personal.
Yeah, it's the smallest architecture school in the country, actually.
And it's a bachelor's degree or a master's?
It's a master's degree.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll tell you more about
Okay.
the school. Don't worry. There's a better spot. I'll show you some pictures of student
Okay.
work. Yeah, absolutely. So, that's where Mr. and Mrs. Wright would have tea on occasion, and then the living room or garden room, which we'll be heading into on the tour. But the pool here might seem a little bit out of place in the middle of the desert, but I did mention their water situation changes after a few years. So Mr. Wright is pretty convinced that there's water out here somewhere when he buys the property, but for the first few years he has to send the apprentices off to the nearest neighbors, which were ranches about 10 to 20 miles away, to buy water off of them and then bring it back here for them to use in day-to-day uses and construction. But once Mr. Wright brings out a well digger, he basically tells them to dig until they find water. And almost 500 feet down, they do find an underground river, which is part of an underground aquifer that runs through the McDowell Mountains here. So they had water for day-to-day uses, construction, and a few fountain features that we'll see around the site. This pool here has a few different functions, besides just looking nice, of course. If there's a fire, you could use this pool, form a bucket brigade, hopefully put it out as quickly as possible. On a hot day, this is a nice place to come cool off a little bit. It's only about 18 inches deep, but that's enough to stick your feet in there. And then all the canvas on the roof. First was stuck into the spool, and that's because wet canvas is a lot easier to stretch than dry canvas. They would stretch it as tight as possible, nail it down, and then when it dries in the sun, it dries really nice and taut. The water on our site today, it still comes from that well that Mr. Wright found. We're not connected to the city of Scottsdale's water at all, and we like to kind of joke that it's the fountain of youth, actually. Since Mr. Wright lived to be almost 92, his apprentices seem to be living rather long lives, so take a drink from our water fountains while you're here. You never know. And the grass here, another feature that might seem a little out of place in the middle of the desert, but Mr. Wright does design all the landscape architecture, and the grass is pretty much just a comfort factor. It's a lot more comfortable to stand or sit on grass than it is the rocky desert out there. And also maybe a little slice of Wisconsin here in Arizona. Mr. Wright was spending his winters out here. Maybe he missed it a little bit. But any questions at this point? No? Alright, well we're just going to move down to the point that has the same vast, endless space as an ocean. The mountains could be islands and the cactus could be coral formations. And then his buildings, with their canvas roofs on them, kind of like a fleet of ships with canvas sails. So he decided to call the prize. He also says he sees geometric shapes in the mountains all around us, especially triangles. So if you haven't noticed our triangles on the site yet, you'll start noticing them now. They're pretty much everywhere. Of course, we were just standing next to the triangular pool. We're standing on one big triangle. If you use the main complex as a side, and then the roof line of the living room at this end of the complex. So a lot of roof lines are triangular, but the angle of the roof here matches the angle of the mountain behind it. And he does this quite a bit. It just kind of depends on your point of view, where you're standing on the property, but he's really doing everything he can to blend his buildings into their background. But after a summer away in Wisconsin, Mr. Wright comes back to Arizona and finds power lines in his inspirational view out here. Very upset about this, as you can imagine. So upset, the story goes, that he makes a phone call to the President of the United States to either get them moved or torn down, but obviously the President has a few more important things to worry about than power lines. So they stayed there, and Mr. Wright threatens to tear down all his buildings here and move everyone to Tucson. He's seen some property out there. He figured no one would ever move out to Tucson. But Mrs. Wright talks him down a little bit. Tells him they've been starting over ever since she met him, and at this point he's 80 years old, so maybe they should settle down a little bit. He sees some reasoning in this, thankfully, otherwise we wouldn't have these buildings here. But he does change his design a little bit. So the original dining room, where that band of windows is, was moved to the opposite side of the complex. So you don't get a view of the valley or the power lines at all. You focus on the mountains on the other side. And then the living room, on the right-hand side here, he raises the walls a little bit. So you just get that narrow band of windows, lowers the roof line. So again, you can't really see the power lines too much. You just focus on the garden that's on the other side of that room and the mountains beyond. And keep in mind, he's only seeing the little wooden power poles that are out there, not the giant metal ones that we have today, so I don't even want to know what he would have to say about those. But he hates the power line so much, he doesn't bring electricity to the site until 1951. He waits until he can have the power lines come discreetly around the back of the property instead of running straight up here. He doesn't want to have to see that. He doesn't want anybody else to see that. So for quite a while they were using gas lanterns and a generator to run a couple concrete mixers to make the walls. So really kind of camping for quite a while out here.
In his 80s.
In his 80s, yeah. Construction began when he was 70 years old, which is kind of incredible. All right, well, let's move in European styles of architecture that had been pretty much everywhere in America up until this point. He said he wanted to create a new American style of architecture or a new democratic style. And part of that idea was his Usonian homes. His Usonian homes, which Usonian stands for United States of North America, in case you were wondering where that word comes from. But Usonian homes were usually smaller or basically designed so they could be more affordable for maybe every class of citizen. And he usually designs them in an L shape. So on the larger side of the L, he'd have one main unit room with living room, kitchen, and dining room in an open floor plan. Another modern idea. A lot of people want that in their homes today. But on the shorter side of the L, he'd have 1 or 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. And he's really designing his private living quarters here on the site in a very similar way. He designs it in an L shape. The large side of the L is right next to us here. It's mostly living room, connected to a private dining room and a kitchen. And then the short side of the L, he has his bedroom, Mrs. Wright's bedroom, and a couple bathrooms. And we'll see that in a moment. But another way he wants to move away from Victorian architecture is by hiding the front door here. He does this quite a bit in different designs. He says Victorian homes have these large, elaborate front doors, and with that, you're going to miss the rest of the architecture. You're so distracted by this door. Which, of course, he doesn't want you to miss the architecture. He's designed every little piece of that home. He wants you to admire every little piece. So he'll hide the front door like this. Also making a pretty clear statement that this is private space. If you're not invited, if you're not told where the front door is, you won't be in there. It's just for family, special guests. But we've all been invited, don't worry, we can go in. But before we go in, there's another Chinese sculpture here. A place of transition, that's appropriate. But next to this one, you'll find a red ceramic tile. So these red squares started off on some of Mr. Wright's designs as a signature, basically. It would be in one of the corners of the design with his initials FLLW in them. But then he started making some of these red ceramic tiles, and to use as pretty much a stamp of approval. So he saved them for the homes he thought complied with his design 100%. And to give you some idea, he had over 400 buildings constructed in his lifetime. Only about 30 of them got one of these red squares. If you're a client of Mr. Wright's, maybe you have some designs for the home that you're going to be living in. Or maybe you have some ideas for the use of space in your home. If you like to entertain, maybe you want some more entertainment space. Mr. Wright took this into consideration, but he also thought he knew what his clients should have and what they needed in their homes. So quite a few people were changing his design a little bit. Or he in the home that he designed that he lived in, he did himself as a stamp of approval. As we go into the living room, check it out. It's kind of neat. He inscribes his initials into the ceramic. We have another compressor release as we go in, so watch your heads again. This one is pretty dramatic. But once you're inside, feel free to have a seat. Victorian homes, boxes, little boxes inside as rooms. So really trying to do something different here. Especially if you try to find the corners to the room. There's definitely a lot more than your usual for. If you look at the corner over there, he kind of pops it back in towards the center of the room. And then he puts the structural supports in unexpected places. Like the fireplace here, not in the center of the room, like you might expect, pushed off to the side a little bit. And that allows him to push these glass walls out. So you get a really nice connection with the outdoors. And then remember, those first 10 years, no glass at all. So a very literal connection with nature in here.
No glass over here.
Yeah, no glass anywhere.
Does it rain?
Yeah, rain was a bit of an issue. But the blue spires that we saw up there, remember they could tie canvas down to cover the openings. So they had a system at least, but I'm sure it was a lot of work. All the furniture in here, Frank Lloyd Wright design, but reconstruction, that's why we get to sit in it. If you've been to any other Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, you don't usually get to sit in the furniture. You'll see a lot of geometric shapes in the furniture though. There's hexagonal tables, the square stools, and then these Taliesin wing chairs that some of you are sitting in. So very geometric. Mr. Wright uses one piece of plywood, he cuts it in several different places, angles it just so. Get a very Asian-inspired chair. Also, he said he built this in a way where he thought you would look the most presentable when you sat in them. So I hope you feel presentable in them. Mr. Wright also really likes built-in furniture. These built-in benches you'll find pretty often in homes he's designed. We like to call this client-proof furniture. Maybe not so applicable in his own home here, but he was known to show up unannounced at homes he designed, go in and move the furniture back where he thought it should be. So he loved built-in furniture. His clients can move it around on him. But you'll notice this room is pretty big. When Mr. Wright came here, he brought his third wife, Oglevana, and their 2 daughters that they had together. So kind of big for 4 people. They did entertain quite a bit. So every Saturday night, actually, was a Taliesin evening. It was a formal dinner with some kind of entertainment afterwards, which could range from music performance to dance performance to play or a poetry reading. So really all forms of art here at the site. And Mr. Wright took these opportunities to invite some more notable or maybe some more famous figures throughout history here to the site to kind of show off his architecture a little bit. But he also made sure to invite the apprentices to these events. He wanted them to learn how to socialize. If you're an architect, it's really important to know how to talk to your clients, sell your designs. Mr. Wright himself, pretty incredible salesman, could sell almost anybody anything. So wanted his apprentices to have that same skill. And if the apprentices weren't attending these formal occasions, they were cooking, cleaning, preparing, and serving dinner for these formal occasions. So really doing a little bit of everything here at the site. Mr. and Mrs. Wright believed in the philosophy that if you're teaching an individual, you should teach the whole individual. And Mrs. Wright is the one who said that if you've never worked in a kitchen, you won't know how to design a kitchen. Which actually makes a lot of sense. So these apprentices were working in the kitchens, working pretty much everywhere.
Were the performances here in the living room?
Sometimes here. There are a couple more performance spaces on the property. Actually, our last stop will be the Cabaret Dinner Theater, which you'll get to see. A perfect spot for performing in there. And when Mr. Wright asked some of these apprentices to come study with him, he told them to bring formal attire for these occasions, but also told them to bring a musical instrument with them. Mr. Wright was incredibly influenced by music. He calls architecture frozen music. He played the piano by ear, had up to 14 pianos at one point in his lifetime. And the early days, when they were migrating back and forth between Wisconsin and Arizona, they took 1 or 2 pianos back and forth with them. Mr. Wright always had to have his pianos with him. This piano here is an original Steinway, so that's kind of neat. But Mr. Wright was known to use musical terms to describe some of his buildings, like crescendo, manifesto, and opus. So really important inspiration for him. Wanted his apprentices to have that same inspiration, but I'm sure the apprentices were also doing a little bit of entertaining during these Taliesin evenings. One really important relationship that Mr. Wright had with a more notable figure that he invited here on occasion was Henry Luce. And Henry Luce was the owner of Time and Life magazine. Henry Luce's wife was Claire Booth Luce. She was a U.S. ambassador, playwright, and artist. And she designed 2 sculptures we have in the room. So the one behind me here is called Desert Sun, and then there's one on the wall where we came in called Desert Moon. And she used pieces that she found out in the desert to create these, so a little bit of nature inside. But in 1938, it's Henry Luce that features Frank Lloyd Wright on the cover of Time magazine. And this is a really important turning point in his career. I mentioned at the beginning he had that period of time where he didn't have a lot of work coming in. But finally, in 1938, people are reading about him in Time magazine, reading about his commission at Falling Water, his Usonian home ideas, and realizing he has something really new and is contributing something unique to architecture. So they start hiring him again. So much so that he does about 1/3 of his work in the last 20 years of his life after that cover. So really important. But another interesting piece of art we have in the room, also down at this end. So you folks over here, you'll definitely get a chance to see it when we head out. But it's a bust of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it was done by one of his former apprentices. So she came here to study architecture, but Mr. and Mrs. Wright both saw that she had some skill in sculpting, so they encouraged her to do that instead. So she did, and had a very successful career, internationally well known, and any of the sculptures you see on the site here today were done by her. Her name is Heloise Christa, and she's the one who sculpted all the sculptures around the base of that spire that we saw in Frank Lloyd Wright's office. And she still lives here as well. One of the apprentices that never left. She's in her early 90s and still designing sculptures, but not physically making them. So, really. Any questions in this room?
When was AC added to these buildings?
Very good question. Early 1990s. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so not original, not Frank Lloyd Wright design. These vents in the floor, that's for air conditioning. They started getting towards in the summer. Pretty is that? Circular door back there, that's the moon gate. Another Asian-inspired idea that Mr. Wright liked. Originally, a tennis court on the other side of that wall there did offices with the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, so not used too often. There's definitely easier ways to get around the site, but we're happy to bring up that wall back there. And we also have our sculptures here next to the living room, our garden stripes. And these were original to the Midway Gardens that Mr. Wright designed in Chicago, which was torn down during Prohibition as a beer garden for a while. So most of these sculptures were lost, but about a handful of them were returned to the Wright family. So we have 2 here, originally not painted, but I've been told that Mr. Wright's daughters were the ones that painted them in the same color palette that you'll see all around the site. And then the room up here, that's very open. This was originally Mrs. Wright's bedroom. And Mr. Wright was really playing with the idea of what's inside and what's outside, blurring that line between the two. I don't know if Mrs. Wright liked that idea too much, though, because she was the one who installed the panels here, so she could decide when she was inside or outside. But she still had to come out to use her closet, which is where those closed doors are on the right-hand side there. And then her bathroom was kind of down the hall and around the corner. So eventually they put in a different bedroom for her. That was a little more enclosed. Would have been on the other side of Mr. Wright's bedroom here. And still being used as offices by the foundation today, but the next phase of reconstruction, they want to bring that back to what it looked like. Once Mrs. Wright had her second bedroom, they turned this room into a private sitting room for the family and called it Swan Cove because of the screen print that's on the back wall there. That's a reproduction of the original screen print. The original one's now in the Frank Lloyd Wright Archives, which was recently moved to New York City, where it's split between the Museum of Modern Art and Columbia University. And Frank Lloyd Wright Archives, one of the largest archives of any known artist. He had tens of thousands of drawings and designs, thousands of letters that he wrote to friends and clients, so a lot of material, which is good for our conservation team, because when they bring rooms back to what they used to look like, they have quite a job. This room here and Mr. Wright's bedroom recently reconstructed in the early 2000s, and our conservation team has to be very specific about the time period they want to bring it back to. Since Mr. Wright was always changing his design, always adding things, it could be kind of tricky. But I believe they brought these two back to what they looked like in the early 1950s. We can head in Mr. Wright's bedroom. I'm not sure. It's a screen print, I believe. But yeah, if you want to head right into the bedroom here, feel free to have a seat. And you can sit on his bed. Don't be shy. Somebody's curious as to why they had two separate bedrooms. That was just because Mr. Wright was known to work at all hours of day and night. So he might get up, do some work, take a couple naps during the day, and Mrs. Wright liked her full night's sleep. So two separate bedrooms worked pretty well for them. But Mr. Wright does have a very interesting bed around the corner here. Divided in the middle, so it has two separate sides to it. And he had a system in place for this. So there's a window outside the doors we just walked through that the apprentices could look through. And if they saw him sleeping on the left side of the bed, they knew that was his night's bed and his night's rest, so they shouldn't bother him. But if he was sleeping on the right-hand side of the bed, that was his day then. He was just napping. They could come in, wake him up, ask him questions. Kind of weird, but I guess it worked for them. Any of the books you see in the room here, books that Mr. Wright would have had. So he's a very avid reader, encouraged his apprentices to read as well. So our conservation team just asked some of Mr. Wright's former apprentices which books they borrowed from him, so they were able to put the correct books back. You'll notice lots of different art books, Japanese art, French cathedrals, and some philosophy books, so a little bit of everything. But once they have electricity on the site, Mr. Wright likes to experiment with lighting a little bit. Now we have a couple different types in this room. So we are having some sunlight come through the clerestory window between the low ceiling and the high ceiling up here. And that can bounce off the white of the high ceiling, and reflect off that, fill the room with a little bit of a glow, kind of like the canvas does. But he also puts lights on the top side of the beams here, so it points up at the white to reflect off and then fill the room again. But he also puts lights on the underside of the beams, inset lighting. So at either end you basically have a little hole with a light hole. Simple but effective. And one more thing in here, if you're curious about a Frank Lloyd Wright bathroom, there's one around the corner there. Around the time he was designing this room, he discovered sheet metal. Had to use it in some element of his design, so he tries it out in the bathroom. You can go ahead and take a look at it. Very modern looking, so modern that I think it belongs on a spaceship. That's just my opinion. But yeah, if you all want to take a look at that, take a look around here a little bit, and meet you back outside when you're ready. And Mr. Wright placed the perfect size, perfect position he wanted it, and that pot was right in the center. He didn't want to change his design at all, but the pot stuck out a little bit when they put glass in. So instead of changing anything, he just cuts a hole in the glass around the pot. Yeah, had to have it the way he wanted it.
Is that a mental illness?
Perfection.
Oh.
Well, I can start sending you all down the stone passageway here, if you head down there, I'll meet you on the other side by the pool and the little fountain. That's it. Right up here. This is the water tower, the tallest point on the property. So it gives you some idea of how low all these buildings are, close to the earth like Mr. Wright liked them. He was always changing the design at the top of the water tower, and that's the last he had before he passed away. Very Asian-inspired design, I think. Common question I get at this point, so I'll tell you before anybody asks. What are these squares in the wall here? They're just for airflow and ventilation. Nothing too exciting. I personally think it kind of looks like there should be a cannon in there or something. But there's bathrooms and the kitchen that connects to the private dining room and the living rooms on the other side, so it's ventilation. And then there is another petroglyph right here. I like to point this one out. It's a little bit harder to see than some of the other ones. So once you have a look at that, we can head into the structure here, the Kiva. Kiva is a term for a Southwest Native American spiritual structure that was usually built underground with 4 square walls and a hole in the ceiling with a ladder so people could get in and out. And it was reminiscent of the Native American origin story that people emerged from the earth. This structure, kind of similar to that idea of that structure. You feel like you're underground, you have your 4 square walls, and then the molding on the ceiling almost seems like there should be a hole up there. But this room was used for several different functions. So this is where everything was stored when they left for the summers. So all the carpets, furniture, pretty much anything they weren't taking back to Wisconsin, they put in here. This is also a pretty safe place to come if there's a fire. Since they were so isolated out here, there's really nowhere for them to go. So they had to build their own safe place. Originally, this structure didn't even have windows in it. So pretty enclosed. This is also, or was also, an early meeting room, classroom. Still kind of used as the same today, as you can tell. But Mr. Wright loved to use this space to watch movies. He loved movies. See our movie screen here. There was a projection room on the other side of that wall there. The projector could come through the middle square. He loved to watch the uncut versions of movies. So 10 to 12 hour long movies. He really liked to critique them. And Mrs. Wright said there was no movie so bad he wouldn't watch it twice. So a lot of time spent with movies. I guess they had movie screenings once or twice a week. So the apprentices had to watch with him. So hopefully they also like to watch movies. Mr. Wright had a couple close connections to Hollywood, besides some actor and director friends. So his oldest son, Lloyd Wright Jr., was a set designer for Paramount Pictures for a while, before he becomes an architect. And Mr. Wright's granddaughter was the actress Anne Baxter, if anyone's heard of her. Popular in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
What's her name?
Anne Baxter. Starred in the movie All About Eve. Yeah. Sometimes people have heard of her. Yeah, apparently he inspired her to be an actress because he designed her a little stage when she was a little girl. Kind of cute. And Mr. Wright also liked to use this space to experiment with lighting a little bit. So when you came in here, it might have taken you a moment for your eyes to adjust. It's pretty dark. But this is the original lighting for the room. So track lighting was put in later. Pretty dark in here, but you still have 4 types of lighting. So you have inset lighting in the molding on the ceiling here. These sconces that hang in front of the corners, supposed to be abstractions of nature, maybe abstract butterflies. The 2 sidewalls here, really creative use of light. He's pointing the light beams so you get these triangle shadows in between, which are mimicking the mountains that are all around us. And then inset floor lighting. This is a Franklin Wright invention. He never copyrighted, never patented the idea. He wanted it to be used by everybody and be a part of all of architecture, which pretty much worked. You can find this in a lot of different places today. Mr. Wright was very forward-thinking, really ahead of his time. I know I've mentioned a few really modern ideas he's had so far, but one interesting idea, he designed a drive-through bank teller. But he designed it at the time when people thought he was crazy, and no one would ever do banking from their cars. So it was never built. But of course, something we do almost every day today. We do pretty much anything from our cars. The 2 side walls here, we have some examples of student work from our students today in school. So I mentioned at the beginning of the tour that all of our students live on the site, and most of them choose to live in a desert shelter. So you'll see some examples of these in the 2 posters here. So you'll see a green leafy one. They started building shelters in Wisconsin as well, but there's about 19 standing structures on the site here today, all built by former students of the school. And our students enrolled today can choose which shelter they want to live in and have a $2,000 grant to either fix any problems with the shelter they chose, continue with the design that wasn't completed by a former student, or build an entirely new shelter. There's space for about 30 or 40 more to be built out there. And they're really kind of just camping, like Mr. Wright's apprentices were doing when they were here, because there's no electricity and no plumbing out there. So pretty basic, but it gives them a really great chance to actually build their designs, hands-on learning, like Mr. Wright's apprentices. Our school today, pretty unique, and I told you a little bit about it at the very beginning. Just a master's degree, so all of our students come with a bachelor's in a related field already, all the prerequisite courses completed, and a portfolio of designs. The master's program is about 3 years to complete. On average, it varies a little bit. It's a year-round program, so 12-month academic calendar, and the students still go back and forth between Wisconsin and Arizona. So they'll be in Arizona until about late April, early May, and then they go back to Wisconsin for school in the summer. And still kind of like a normal school though, they have classes, just like any other. Some history classes, theory classes, and they have model building workshops. But the students still help out with things at the site. Maybe not to the extent that Mr. Wright's apprentices did, but they help out in the kitchen with meal prep and dishes. They help out with landscaping, and they still have Taliesin evenings at the site. So not every Saturday night, but once a month, the students are in charge of organizing that whole event. They can invite whoever they want. There's a formal dinner and then some kind of entertainment afterwards, which I've been told is more like a rock band these days. Any questions about the school? I know that was kind of an overview.
What's the average?
Actually, I'll tell you about this one first. So this is a Heloise Christus sculpture. I know a lot of people see a dragon at first, but it's a dancer in flight, with arms and legs outstretched. And once I tell you what it is, then you can see. But she often designs in that kind of greenish blue metal color. But this is a dragon. So this was a Christmas gift to Mrs. Wright the Christmas after Mr. Wright passed away by one of their apprentices named Aaron Green, who went on to be an architect in the San Francisco area. And the dragon here they thought would originally make a nice fountain piece. So they put him in the fountain over here. But Mrs. Wright said that no self-respecting dragon spits water. So they put him up here, hooked it up to a gas line so it would breathe fire. Still does today. You might notice some singed leaves down here. So we give tours at night sometimes. It's pretty much the same tour you're getting now, but you do get to see the dragon breathing fire, which is kind of neat.
Where did Frank Lloyd Wright die here, or where did he die?
Good question. Where did Frank Lloyd Wright die? So he did die in Arizona. He was buried in Wisconsin back in his family's plot. But Mrs. Wright, who was about 30 years younger than him, died about 25 years after he died. And one of her last requests was to have his remains cremated and moved back to Arizona so their remains could be together. And as far as I know, it's kind of a mystery as to where the remains are. So they're somewhere in Arizona. I'm sure somebody somewhere knows where they are, but they're not passing along that information. So kind of interesting. Hotter than the air up here in the mountain. And air is going to move from hot to cold. And even on days when there's no wind, you still get a little bit of air movement through here. It's really nice on those warmer days. The dining room here, still very much in use. So anybody who lives on the site, all the students, eat lunch and dinner in here. That bell up there with a very Asian-inspired design around it. That rings at 12:30 and 6:30 to let everybody know it's time to eat. And originally our dining room had no glass on it, so we have some really nice pictures of everyone seated at tables coming right out onto the patio here eating their meal. But once there's glass in there, Mr. Wright is again blurring that line between inside and outside. You can tell he pushes this stone support in towards the center of the room, brings those glass walls out, and the doors here in the breezeway that lead to the dining room, you can even open those up, extend tables right out onto the breezeway, and there's a fireplace on the left side in the breezeway there.
Are the fireplaces used so often?
Not really, no, not too often. On our last stop in the Cabaret dinner theater, they were using that for a while on chilly days, but it still gets kind of smoky in there, so they don't work that well.
What's in here?
So these are the apartments that I pointed out.
Oh.
You've just seen them from the other side. Yeah, cafes you can find all around Europe. Mr. and Mrs. Wright both really like the idea of dinner and a show, basically. So they'd often have dinner. You can set up these tables, fold them out, set it up for dinner, set the chairs up around them, and the aisles here. And you can have some kind of entertainment up here on the stage. Their guests would enter the same way you did. So down this aisle right here, And Mr. and Mrs. Wright would be seated at the back table there, greeting everyone as they came in. You'll notice that your seats here are pretty low to the ground. I know all the seats to the site are pretty low to the ground. These, I think, are the lowest. That's because it gives you the perfect angle to look out the windows here. You could open up those flaps and would have gotten a really nice view of the McDowell Mountains behind there. The flaps on the inside of the aisleway, you can latch those upwards. Right. She asked Mr. Wright to move the piano from the center of the stage off to the side. She wants more room for dancing and performing. And if you know anything about the desert, you know there's about 4 feet of loose soil and then a very natural cement called caliche underneath that. And at this point in the room, we're about 2/3 underground.